Nobody in
Hello,
Harding
guys.
Creek forgot
Let's
anything.
dive deeper
That
into
was the
forgotten
first thing
Wild
Marabella
West.
Harrell learned when she was old enough to understand
Hello,
what
guys.
whispers meant.
Let's dive deeper
The second
into
thing
the
she learned
forgotten
was that a
Wild West.
woman's name was the most fragile thing she owned.
Hello, guys.
More fragile
Let's
than
dive
glass,
deeper
more
into the
difficult to
forgotten
repair than a
Wild
broken
West.
fence post, and far more valuable than any acre
Hello,
of land
guys.
her family had
Let's
ever
dive
worked.
deeper into
She
the
had spent
forgotten
24
Wild
years
West.
guarding hers carefully. One evening was all
Hello,
it took
guys.
to lose it.
Let's dive
She hadn't even
deeper
done anything
into
wrong.
The forgotten
That
Wild
was the part
West.
that kept her awake at night, staring at the ceiling of her
Hello,
childhood
guys.
bedroom
Let's
while the
dive
house settled
deeper
around
into
her in the dark.
forgotten Wild West.
She hadn't done anything wrong, and it didn't matter even
Hello,
a little
guys.
bit.
Let's
It had
dive
started with a
deeper
storm,
into the forgotten
The
Wild
kind that
West.
rolled in fast off the flatlands without proper warning,
Hello, guys.
turning the sky
Let's
a greenish
dive
gray
deeper into
and
the
sending
forgotten
horses
Wild
sideways in the
West.
street. Marabella had been in town
Hello,
that
guys.
Thursday
Let's
to collect
dive
fabric her
deeper
mother had
into the
ordered from the
forgotten
dry goods
Wild
store.
West.
She'd finished her errand, stepped outside,
Hello, guys.
and watched the sky
Let's
drop
dive
like a
deeper
curtain being
into the
pulled.
forgotten Wild
She made
West.
it half a block before the rain came sideways and hard.
Hello, guys.
The nearest
Let's
shelter was
dive
Grady's
deeper
feed and
into the
supply,
forgotten
a
Wild
wide,
West.
low building with a covered porch and an unlocked
Hello,
side
guys.
door that half
Let's
the town
dive
used
deeper
freely when
into
weather
the
turned
forgotten
bad.
Wild West.
She ducked inside without thinking, shook the rain
Hello,
from her
guys.
hat.
Let's dive
breathed.
deeper into the
She was not
forgotten
alone.
Wild West.
Byron Ardent was leaning against the far wall
Hello, guys.
with his arms
Let's
crossed,
dive
watching the
deeper
rain
into
the same way she
forgotten Wild
imagined he
West.
watched most things, like it personally
Hello,
irritated him.
guys. Let's
He was tall
dive
in a way
deeper
that made
into the
rooms feel
forgotten
smaller,
Wild West.
with dark eyes that never quite settled,
Hello,
and a
guys.
reputation in Harding
Let's
Creek
dive
that
deeper
walked
into
into
the
a room
forgotten
several
Wild
seconds
West.
before he did. He was not a bad man exactly,
Hello, guys.
but he was
Let's
not a
dive
comfortable one
deeper
either.
Into the forgotten
He looked at her
Wild West.
the way she looked at him, like a complication she
Hello,
hadn't
guys.
budgeted for.
Let's dive deeper
Miss Harrell,
into the
he said.
forgotten Wild West.
Mr. Ardent, she replied.
Hello,
Then
guys.
they both looked back
Let's
at the
dive
rain
deeper
and said
into the
nothing else for a
forgotten
long
Wild
time.
West.
That should have been the end of it.
Hello, guys.
Two people
Let's
waiting out a
dive
storm in a
deeper
town
into the
building,
forgotten
6
Wild
feet of
West.
empty space between them. Not a single word of
Hello,
consequence
guys.
exchanged.
Let's dive deeper
Marabella
into
had
the
gone over it
forgotten
100
Wild
times
West.
since, looking for the moment she could have done something
Hello,
differently.
guys. Let's
She
dive
always came up
deeper
empty.
into the forgotten
What she
Wild
hadn't accounted
West.
for was Dora Finch. Dora
Hello,
Finch,
guys.
who had
Let's
seen
dive
Marabella
deeper
slip into the side door of
forgotten
Grady's
Wild West.
and had thought nothing of it, until she saw Byron
Hello, guys.
Ardent leave through the
Let's
same door
dive
40
deeper
minutes
into
later,
the forgotten
collar
Wild
damp,
West.
expression unreadable.
Welcome to another
Dora
video.
had a mind like a filing
Let's
cabinet
begin delving
and a mouth
in
like a
Wild
telegraph
West.
wire. By Friday morning,
Welcome to
the
another
story had
video.
grown 3 details
Let's
it
begin
had never
delving
actually
in
contained.
Wild West.
By Sunday, it had a different ending entirely.
Welcome to another video.
Marabella first
Let's
heard it
begin
from her
delving
cousin Frances,
in Wild
who
West.
delivered the news the way people delivered bad news in
Welcome
small
to another
towns,
video.
with wide
Let's
eyes
begin
and a lowered
delving
voice,
in
and
Wild
the
West.
particular satisfaction of being the one to tell
Welcome
it.
to another video.
People are talking,
Let's begin delving
Frances said,
in Wild
setting down
West.
her coffee cup with unnecessary care.
Welcome to another
Marabella
video.
looked at her.
Let's
People
begin
are always
delving
talking
in Wild West.
about you and Byron Ardent.
Welcome to another
Frances
video.
paused.
Let's
Together,
begin delving
in Grady's.
in Wild West.
The silence that followed was the kind that
Welcome
had weight.
to another video.
Marabella set
Let's
down her
begin
own cup.
delving in Wild
Slowly.
West.
We were waiting out a storm,
Welcome
the
to
same as
another
anyone
video.
would.
Let's
I know
begin
that,
delving
Frances
in
said.
Wild West.
But that isn't the version going around.
Welcome to
She
another
went to
video.
her mother first,
Let's
which
begin
was a
delving
mistake.
in Wild West.
Eleanor Harrell had built her entire sense of security
Welcome
on the
to another
family's
video.
standing in Harding Creek.
Let's begin
And
delving
the look on her face
in
when
Wild
Marabella
West.
explained the situation was not the look
Welcome
of
to
a woman
another
preparing
video.
to defend her daughter.
Let's begin delving.
It was the look of
in
a woman
Wild
calculating damage. You should have gone somewhere else,
Welcome
her
to
mother
another
said quietly.
video.
There wasn't anywhere
Let's
else.
begin delving
It was pouring.
in Wild West.
You should have waited in the street. Marabella stared at
Welcome
her.
to another
In
video.
a storm. Her
Let's
mother
begin
didn't answer that
delving
directly.
in Wild
Instead,
West.
she folded her hands in her lap and looked out the window
Welcome
of the
to
yard
another
where
video.
Marabella's father was working,
Let's begin delving
oblivious,
in
and
Wild
said,
West.
"Your father is going to hear about this before supper.
Welcome to
I'd
another
like to have
video.
something to tell him."
Let's begin
was nothing to
delving
tell.
in Wild
That
West.
was the problem. An absence of
Welcome to
wrongdoing
another
offered
video.
no defense against
Let's
a story
begin delving
that had already
in
taken
Wild
root.
West.
Byron Ardent heard the rumors on Saturday.
Welcome to another
He heard
Wild
them from
West
3
tale
different people
showing
in the span of 2
love
hours,
comes from
each version
unexpected
slightly
means.
larger than the last.
Welcome
And by
to
the time
another
the
Wild
third man
West tale
clapped him on the
showing
shoulder with a knowing
love
look,
comes from
Byron had
unexpected
stopped
means.
correcting anyone.
Welcome
Not because
to
he
another
didn't want
Wild
to,
West tale
but
showing
because he recognized,
love comes from
with the particular
unexpected
clarity
means.
of someone who had lived in a small
Welcome
town
to
long
another
enough,
Wild West
that
tale
correcting a
showing
rumor in Harding Creek
love
was
comes
roughly
from
as effective
unexpected
as arguing with
means.
weather. He didn't
Welcome
like
to another
Marabella
Wild
Harrell.
West tale
He
showing
wanted to be clear about
love
that,
comes
at
from
least to himself.
unexpected means.
She was sharp-tongued
Welcome
and
to
proud,
another Wild
and had
West
looked at him
tale
for
showing
years with an expression
love
that
comes
suggested
from
he
unexpected
was something
means.
she'd nearly stepped on.
Welcome to
Whatever
another
had passed
Wild
between
West
their
tale
families
showing
before he was old enough to
love
understand,
comes from
it had left a
unexpected
residue
means.
neither of them had ever bothered to clean
Welcome
up.
to another Wild
They had
West
managed
tale
a civil
showing
distance for years.
love comes
That
from
had always felt like
unexpected
enough.
means.
It didn't feel like enough
Welcome to
now.
another Wild West tale
The meeting
showing
happened on a Monday.
love comes
Marabella
from
didn't know it
unexpected
was coming.
means.
She was in the front room
Welcome to
hemming a
another
skirt when her
Wild
father
West
appeared in the
tale
doorway
showing
with his hat still on,
love comes
which
from
meant he hadn't been home
unexpected
long,
means.
and an expression she didn't
Welcome to
immediately
another
recognize.
Wild West tale
Behind
showing
him, barely
love
visible in the
comes
hall,
from unexpected
was her
means.
mother. And behind
Welcome
her
to
mother,
another Wild
standing
West
just
tale
inside the
showing
front door,
love
with his own
comes
hat in
from
his hands,
unexpected
and his
means.
jaw set like a man
Welcome
preparing
to
for
another
something
Wild
unpleasant,
West tale
was
showing
Byron Ardent.
love comes from
Marabella
unexpected
put down her
means.
sewing. "Sit down, Belle,"
Welcome to
her
another
father
Wild
said.
West tale
His voice was
showing
careful,
love
measured,
comes
the
from
voice he used when
unexpected
he had
means.
already made a decision and
Hello,
was now
guys.
informing her
Let's
of it.
dive deeper
She
into
didn't
the
sit down.
forgotten Wild West.
"What is this?" Her father looked briefly at Byron,
Hello,
then
guys.
back at her.
Let's dive deeper.
"Mr. Ardent
into the
came to speak with me
forgotten
this
Wild
morning.
West.
We've had a conversation." He paused.
Hello, guys.
A long
Let's
one.
dive deeper
The room
into
felt
the
suddenly
forgotten
smaller.
Wild West.
Marabella looked at Byron directly for the first time since
Hello,
Grady's.
guys. Let's dive
His expression
deeper
gave away
into the
almost
forgotten
nothing,
Wild
almost,
West.
except for something tight around the eyes that told her
Hello, guys.
he was no
Let's
happier
dive
about
deeper
this than
into
she
the
was about to
forgotten
be.
Wild West.
"We've come to an agreement," her father continued.
Hello,
"One
guys.
that protects you
Let's
both."
dive deeper
"What
into
agreement?"
the forgotten
she said.
Wild West.
It wasn't a question. The way her mother was standing,
Hello, guys.
too
Let's
still,
dive
too
deeper
careful,
into
already
the
told
forgotten
her.
Wild West.
Her father straightened. "You'll be married by the end of the month."
Hello, guys.
The
Let's
skirt
dive
slipped
deeper
from Marabella's
into
lap
the
to the
forgotten
floor.
Wild West.
She didn't look at her father. She didn't look at her mother.
Welcome to another video.
She looked at Byron
Let's
Ardent,
begin
who
delving
was already
in
looking at
Wild
her,
West.
and in the silence between them was every cold
Welcome
word they
to
had
another
ever
video.
exchanged, every
Let's begin
sideways
delving
glance,
in Wild
every year
West.
of careful distance, now collapsed
Welcome
into
to
something
another
neither
video.
of them had any idea
Let's
how to
begin
carry.
delving in
He didn't
Wild
look
West.
triumphant. She had expected that.
Welcome to another video.
Some flicker
Let's
of
begin
satisfaction.
delving in
There
Wild
was none.
West.
He just looked like a man who had walked into
Welcome
a
to
room
another video.
and found the door locked
Let's
behind
begin
him.
delving in Wild West.
The wedding was small. That was the word
Hello,
people
guys.
used.
Let's
Small,
dive deeper
when what they
into
meant
the
was
forgotten
rushed,
Wild West.
and what they meant beneath that was shameful.
Hello, guys.
Marabella heard it
Let's
3 times
dive
in the
deeper
6 days
into the
between her
forgotten
father's
Wild
announcement
West.
and the ceremony itself. Always
Hello,
spoken with
guys.
that particular
Let's
softness
dive deeper
that made it
into the
worse than if they'd
forgotten
simply
Wild
said
West.
what they were thinking. She wore her
Hello,
mother's
guys.
dress,
Let's
taken in at
dive
the waist
deeper
and
into
let
the
out at the
forgotten
shoulders.
Wild West.
And she stood in the front room of the Harrell house on a Thursday
Hello,
morning
guys.
with
Let's
flowers
dive
she hadn't
deeper
chosen,
into the forgotten
and a man
Wild
she hadn't
West.
chosen, and a future that felt like a door
Hello, guys.
someone else had opened
Let's dive
and shoved her
deeper
through.
into the forgotten
Byron
Wild
stood
West.
beside her in a dark coat, that fit him well enough to
Hello,
suggest
guys.
he owned it
Let's
already,
dive deeper
which meant he
into the
hadn't gone
forgotten
out and
Wild
bought something
West.
new for this, which for reasons she couldn't quite
Hello,
explain,
guys.
made
Let's
her quietly
dive deeper
furious.
into the forgotten
The Reverend
Wild
spoke.
West.
They answered when they were supposed to.
Hello, guys.
Byron's
Let's
voice was
dive
steady.
deeper into the
Marabella
forgotten
made sure
Wild
hers
West.
was steadier. When it was done, her mother
Hello,
cried
guys.
softly into
Let's
a handkerchief,
dive deeper
and her
into the
father shook
forgotten
Byron's
Wild
hand
West.
for a long moment without saying anything. And
Hello,
Francis
guys.
watched from the corner
Let's
with an
dive
expression
deeper
caught
into the
somewhere between
forgotten
sympathy
Wild
and
West.
fascination. Byron Ardent held out his
Hello,
arm to
guys.
his wife.
Let's dive
Marabella
deeper
took
into
it
the
without
forgotten
looking at him.
Wild West.
The Ardent property sat 4 miles east of town.
Hello, guys.
A working
Let's
ranch with a
dive
main
deeper
house,
into the
a
forgotten
bunkhouse,
Wild
2
West.
barns, and more fence line than Marabella had expected.
Hello, guys. Let's
was not a
dive
poor man's
deeper
land.
into the forgotten
She had
Wild
known that,
West.
distantly. The way you know facts about
Hello,
people
guys.
you've chosen
Let's
not to think
dive
about
deeper
too
into
carefully.
the forgotten Wild
Seeing it up
West.
close was different. The house itself was well
Hello,
built
guys.
and largely
Let's
empty.
dive deeper
Not
into
neglected.
the forgotten
Clean,
Wild
actually,
West.
in the deliberate way of a man who lived alone
Hello,
and had
guys.
decided to be
Let's
orderly about
dive
it.
deeper into
but
the
absent of
forgotten
anything
Wild
soft.
West.
No curtains that hadn't come with the house.
Hello,
no
guys.
rugs.
Let's
The kitchen
dive
had what it
deeper
needed,
into the
and
forgotten
nothing more.
Wild West.
A woman named Patrice, who cooked and
Hello,
managed
guys.
the house 3
Let's
days a week,
dive deeper
showed
into the
Marabella
forgotten
around with
Wild
a warmth
West.
that felt genuine and a carefulness that suggested
Hello, guys.
Byron had spoken
Let's
to her
dive
beforehand.
deeper into the forgotten
Your room is at the
Wild
end of the
West.
hall, Patrice said, stopping at a closed door.
Hello, guys.
Mr. Ardent
Let's
had it
dive
prepared for
deeper
you.
into the forgotten Wild
Your room.
West.
Marabella noted the phrasing. She
Hello,
opened
guys.
the door.
Let's dive
The room was
deeper
plain
into
but
the
decent.
forgotten
A good
Wild
bed,
West.
a window that faced east, a small dresser
Hello,
with an empty
guys.
top.
Let's dive
She set her
deeper
bag
into
down
the forgotten
and stood in
Wild
the middle
West.
of it for a moment. Her room, in his
Hello,
house,
guys.
in a
Let's
life that had been
dive
arranged
deeper
around
into
her
the
like
forgotten
furniture
Wild
she
West.
hadn't ordered. Byron gave her space
Hello,
that
guys.
first week.
Let's dive
She recognized
deeper
it as a
into the
deliberate
forgotten
choice rather
Wild
than
West.
indifference, which she wasn't sure was better or
Hello,
worse.
guys. Let's dive
He was up
deeper
before
into the
dawn,
forgotten
out with the
Wild
hands
West.
by the time she came to the kitchen, and back in the
Hello,
evening for
guys.
supper,
Let's dive
which they ate at
deeper
opposite
into
ends
the
of a table
forgotten
built for
Wild
more people
West.
than lived there. He passed the salt when she reached
Hello,
for it.
guys. Let's
He asked
dive
once if the
deeper
room was
into the
comfortable.
forgotten
She said it
Wild
was
West.
fine. That was the longest conversation they had
Hello,
in 7
guys.
days.
Let's dive
It was the
deeper
8th day
into
that
the
changed the
forgotten
shape of
Wild
things.
West.
Marabella had found, mostly out of
Hello,
restlessness,
guys.
that
Let's
the
dive
East Barn
deeper
needed
into the
organizing in a way that
forgotten Wild
nobody had
West.
gotten around to. Tack hung without order.
Hello, guys.
Feed sacks
Let's
stacked
dive
badly.
deeper into
Tools
the
left where they'd
forgotten
been used
Wild
last,
West.
rather than where they belonged. It bothered
Hello,
her in
guys.
a specific and
Let's
practical
dive
way.
deeper into
And
the
since she had
forgotten
nothing else to
Wild
do with her
West.
hands, she started working on it.
Hello,
She had been
guys.
at it for about an
Let's
hour when
dive
Byron
deeper
appeared
into
in the barn
forgotten
doorway.
Wild West.
He looked at what she'd done. Then he looked at her.
Hello, guys. Let's
You don't
dive
have to do
deeper
that,
into
he
the
said.
forgotten Wild
I'm aware,
West.
she replied, and kept working.
Hello, guys.
He was quiet
Let's
for a
dive
moment.
deeper
She
into
could
the
feel him
forgotten
deciding
Wild
something.
West.
Then he came in, picked up the other end of a feed
Hello,
sack
guys.
she was
Let's
moving,
dive
and
deeper
helped her shift it
into
without
the
being
forgotten
asked.
Wild West.
They worked in silence for 20 minutes. It wasn't
Hello,
comfortable
guys.
silence
Let's
exactly,
dive deeper
but it
into
was
the
functional,
forgotten Wild
which felt
West.
like something. You reorganized the whole left
Hello,
wall,
guys.
he
Let's
said eventually.
dive deeper into
was
the
inefficient.
forgotten Wild
I know.
West.
I've been meaning to get to it. She glanced
Hello,
at him
guys.
sideways.
Let's dive deeper
For how long?
into the forgotten
pause.
Wild West.
2 years, approximately. Something shifted
Hello,
briefly
guys.
at the corner
Let's
of her
dive
mouth.
deeper.
She turned
into the
away before it
forgotten
became anything.
Wild West.
The town, of course, was watching. Harding
Hello,
Creek
guys.
had the
Let's
particular
dive
habit of
deeper
monitoring
into
new
the
marriages the way it
forgotten Wild
monitored
West.
weather. Constantly, and with an opinion ready.
Hello, guys. Let's
Marabella
dive
felt it
deeper
every time she
into the
came into town for
forgotten
supplies.
Wild West.
The way conversations adjusted when she walked into a store.
Hello, guys. Let's dive
The way
deeper
women who had known
into
her
the
all her
forgotten
life
Wild
now
West.
looked at her with a new kind of attention, measuring something
Hello,
she
guys.
couldn't quite
Let's
name.
dive deeper
What
into the
bothered her
forgotten
wasn't the
Wild
attention.
West.
She'd expected that. What bothered
Hello,
her
guys.
was
Let's
that she now
dive
arrived in
deeper
town as
into the
Marabella
forgotten
Ardent,
Wild West.
and the name sat in her mouth like something borrowed.
Hello, guys.
And she hadn't decided
Let's
yet
dive
how to
deeper
feel about that.
into the forgotten Wild
She was at the
West.
dry goods store on a Wednesday afternoon when she overheard
Hello, guys.
two women
Let's
talking in the
dive
next
deeper
aisle.
into the
Not about her
forgotten
directly,
Wild West.
but close enough. I heard he's barely spoken to her
Hello,
since
guys.
the wedding.
Let's
One of
dive
them said.
deeper into the
Can you
forgotten
blame him?
Wild
The other
West.
replied. He didn't exactly choose this either.
Hello, guys. Let's
Marabella
dive deeper
stood very still
into the
between
forgotten
two shelves
Wild
of canned
West.
goods and breathed slowly through her nose.
Hello, guys.
She
Let's
paid for her
dive
supplies
deeper into
and
the
walked out
forgotten
without
Wild
hurrying
West.
and drove home without letting herself think too
Hello,
hard
guys.
about
Let's
what had
dive
settled in her
deeper
chest
into the
since the
forgotten
dry goods
Wild
store.
West.
Something that wasn't quite hurt and wasn't
Hello,
quite
guys.
anger,
Let's dive
but was
deeper
made of both.
into the forgotten Wild
That
West.
evening, she found Byron on the porch after supper,
Hello,
which
guys.
was where he went
Let's
most
dive
nights
deeper
for an hour
into the
before
forgotten
coming back
Wild
inside.
West.
She had always gone to her room.
Hello, guys.
Tonight,
Let's
she
dive
didn't.
deeper into
She
the
sat in the
forgotten
other chair,
Wild West.
the one that had clearly not been used in some time,
Hello, guys.
and looked out
Let's
at the
dive
darkening
deeper
land
into the
without
forgotten
saying anything.
Wild West.
Byron glanced at her once, said nothing.
Welcome to another Wild
sat like
West
that for a
tale
while.
showing love comes
I heard
from
something in town
unexpected
today,
means.
she said eventually, not
Welcome
looking
to
at
another
him.
Wild West tale
I imagine you hear
showing
things in town regularly,
love comes
he
from
said,
unexpected means.
about us. She paused.
Welcome to another
About
Wild
you not
West
choosing
tale
this.
showing
Byron
love
was quiet
comes
for a
from
moment.
unexpected
The
means.
land settled into its evening sounds
Welcome
around
to
them.
another Wild
Wind
West
through the
tale
grass,
showing
a horse moving
love
in the near
comes
paddock,
from
the
unexpected
distant
means.
bark of a dog somewhere down the road.
Welcome to another
I didn't
Wild
choose
West
it,
tale
he said.
showing
That's
love
true.
comes from
Neither did I.
unexpected means.
I know that.
Welcome
turned
to
to look
another
at him
Wild
then.
West tale
He
showing
was looking out at the land,
love
jaw
comes
set,
from
the same
unexpected
expression
means.
he'd worn in her father's front room
Welcome to
on the day
another
everything
Wild
changed.
West tale showing
Contained,
love
unreadable,
comes from
tired in a
unexpected
way
means.
that lived deeper than sleep could
Welcome
fix.
to another Wild
Then
West tale
we agree
showing
on something, she
love
said.
comes from
He
unexpected
turned to look at her.
means.
The light was going fast,
Welcome to
and
another
in it,
Wild
his
West
expression
tale
was
showing
difficult to read.
Love comes
But there was
from
something in it she hadn't
unexpected
seen
means.
before. Not
Welcome
softness,
to another
not
Wild
yet,
West tale showing
but something that was at
love
least
comes
not
from
hardness.
unexpected means.
Seems like it, he said.
Welcome to another Wild
Marabella
West
looked
tale
back at the land.
showing
She stayed on the
love
porch for
comes
another
from
hour.
unexpected
So
means.
did he. Neither of them mentioned
Welcome
it the
to
next
another
morning,
Wild
but when
West
Byron
tale
passed through the
showing
kitchen and she
love
handed him a
comes
cup of
from
coffee without
unexpected
being asked,
means.
he took it without surprise.
Welcome to another
And for
Wild
one brief
West
and
tale
confusing
showing
moment, that
love
felt like
comes
more
from
than it probably should
unexpected
have.
means.
She turned back to the stove
Welcome to another
before she could
Wild
think
West
about
tale
why.
showing
2
love
weeks into
comes
their
from
marriage, a
unexpected
letter
means.
arrived from her mother.
Welcome to
Marabella read it
another
at the
Wild
kitchen
West
table while
tale
Byron was
showing
out working.
Love comes
It was
from
warm in the
unexpected
familiar
means.
way her mother's letters always were.
Welcome to
Careful,
another Wild West
full of
tale
small news,
showing
designed to
love
feel
comes
like
from
normal
unexpected
correspondence.
means.
Near the end,
Welcome to
there was a
another
line
Wild
that
West
Marabella
tale
read
showing
twice.
love comes
I hope
from
you are finding your
unexpected
way with him,
means.
Belle. Your father believes he is a
Welcome to
good man
another
underneath
Wild
it all.
West tale
I
showing
think perhaps your father is
love
right.
comes from unexpected
She folded the letter
means.
and set it face down on the table.
Welcome to
A good
another
man
Wild
underneath it
West
all.
tale showing
She thought about the
love
feed
comes
sacks.
from
The salt
unexpected
passed
means.
without being asked. The
Welcome
chair on
to
the
another
porch that
Wild
had never
West
been
tale
used before she
showing
sat in it.
Love comes
She thought
from
about the way he'd
unexpected
looked in her
means.
father's hallway. Not
Welcome to
triumphant,
another Wild
just a
West
man
tale
who had found the
showing
door locked
love
behind him.
comes from unexpected
Marabella picked up the
means.
letter, folded it again,
Welcome to
and
another
slipped it
Wild
into her
West
apron
tale
pocket.
showing
She
love
didn't know yet
comes
what to
from
do with the
unexpected
thought,
means.
but she didn't let it go either.
Welcome to
And that,
another
she
Wild West
supposed, was
tale
new.
showing love
The first
comes
real
from
fight happened over a
unexpected
horse.
means.
It was such a small thing,
Welcome
looking
to
back.
another Wild
A
West
mare
tale
named
showing
Kala that Marabella had
love
started
comes
working
from
with in the mornings.
unexpected means.
A young animal, nervous and
Welcome to
undertrained,
another Wild
that the
West
hands had
tale
largely
showing
given up on.
love comes
Marabella
from
had a
unexpected
patience with
means.
horses that she didn't always have with people.
Welcome to another
And something
Wild
about
West
Kala's
tale
particular
showing
stubbornness
love
had felt
comes
familiar
from
enough to be
unexpected
interesting.
means.
She had been working with her for
Welcome
10
to
days
another
when
Wild
Byron came
West
out to the
tale
paddock one
showing
morning and told her,
love
without
comes
particular
from
gentleness,
unexpected means.
that Calla was going to be sold
Welcome
at
to
the end
another
of the
video.
month.
Let's
Marabella
begin
looked at him over
delving
the fence rail.
in Wild
Why?
West.
She's not worth the feed she costs.
Welcome to
Can't
another
be relied
video.
on. She
Let's
hasn't been
begin
worked
delving
properly.
in Wild
That's not the
West.
same as can't be relied on.
Welcome
Byron's
to another
expression did
video.
the thing it did when he
Let's
thought he
begin
was being
delving
patient.
in Wild West.
I've had 3 hands try with her. She's difficult.
Welcome to another
I've had
video.
10 days with her, and she's
Let's
already
begin
better.
delving in
10
Wild
days isn't a
West.
decision. Then give me 30.
Welcome
His
to
jaw
another
tightened.
video.
It's my
Let's
ranch,
begin
Marabella.
delving in Wild
The way
West.
he said it, not cruel, but
Welcome
definitive.
to another video.
The tone of a man reminding
Let's
a
begin
woman of a
delving
boundary she hadn't
in
asked to
Wild
be shown.
West.
Landed somewhere old and sore.
Welcome to another video.
I'm aware of that.
Let's
she
begin
said quietly.
delving in Wild
You've made it
West.
very clear. She handed him the lead
Welcome
rope
to
and
another
walked
video.
back to the house.
Let's begin
They didn't
delving
speak properly for
in
2
Wild
days.
West.
Not silence born of indifference.
Welcome
The
to
worst
another
kind.
video.
The kind with
Let's
edges,
begin delving
where every meal
in
and every
Wild
doorway
West.
became a small negotiation.
Welcome to another
Patrice,
video.
who noticed everything and
Let's
said
begin
very
delving
little, began
in Wild
humming
West.
while she worked, which Marabella suspected was
Welcome
a
to
deliberate
another
effort
video.
to fill the air
Let's begin
with something
delving
neutral.
in Wild
Byron
West.
didn't bring up Calla. Neither did Marabella.
Welcome to another video.
On the 3rd morning, she came
Let's
outside to
begin
find
delving
Calla still in the paddock,
Wild West.
still there the morning after that. No
Welcome to another
explanation was
video.
offered. She
Let's
didn't ask
begin
for one.
delving in
She simply
Wild
went
West.
back to work with the mare, and if Byron watched from the
Welcome
far
to
fence
another
one
video.
afternoon longer than was
Let's
strictly
begin
necessary,
delving in
neither
Wild
of them
West.
remarked on it. It was Patrice who
Welcome
said it
to
plainly,
another video.
the way only someone with
begin
nothing to
delving
lose
in
Ebisemis
Wild
ever
West.
did. She and Marabella were working in
Welcome
the
to
kitchen on a
another
Friday
video.
afternoon. The
Let's
windows
begin
opened to let
delving
in the cooler
in
air.
Wild West.
When Patrice said without looking up from her work,
Welcome to another
"He's not
video.
easy, but he's not unkind."
Let's begin delving
There's a difference worth
in
noticing.
Wild West.
Marabella kept her eyes on what she was doing.
Welcome to another video.
I notice plenty.
Let's begin delving
imagine you do.
in Wild West.
Patrice paused. He asked me before you came
Welcome to another
what
video.
kinds of things a woman might
Let's
want in a
begin
bedroom
delving
to feel at home.
in Wild West.
Spent a good while thinking about the answer I gave him.
Welcome to another video.
Marabella was quiet for a moment.
Let's begin delving
He didn't tell
in
me
Wild
that.
West.
No, Patrice said simply.
Welcome
He
to
wouldn't.
another video.
She thought about
Let's
that
begin
more than she
delving
intended to.
in Wild West.
There was a version of Byron Ardent that Harding
Welcome
Creek had
to another
assembled over
video.
the years from pieces.
Let's begin
His
delving
bluntness,
in
his
Wild
solitude,
West.
the way he moved through town like a man who
Hello,
had
guys.
decided not
Let's
to need
dive
it.
deeper
She
into
had
the
taken that
forgotten
version
Wild
as the
West.
whole of him. Without much examination,
Hello, guys.
the way
Let's
you accepted
dive
a story
deeper
told
into the
often enough
forgotten
that it
Wild
stopped
West.
needing evidence. But there was this
Hello,
other
guys.
accumulation
Let's
of
dive
small
deeper
things
into the
that didn't fit
forgotten
the assembled
Wild
version.
West.
The feed sacks, the coffee cup,
Hello, guys.
the chair
Let's
on the
dive
porch,
deeper into
the
the
horse
forgotten
still in the
Wild
paddock.
West.
None of it was dramatic. None of it announced
Hello,
itself.
guys. Let's dive
That
deeper
was,
into
she
the
was beginning to
forgotten
understand.
Wild West.
Rather the point.
Hello,
The shift,
guys.
when it
Let's
came,
dive deeper
arrived the way
into the
most
forgotten
real things
Wild
did.
West.
Not as a moment, but as a series of them so
Hello,
close
guys.
together,
Let's
they
dive
eventually
deeper
became
into
something
the
new.
forgotten Wild West.
It was an evening in the 6th week of their marriage.
Hello, guys.
They had fallen
Let's
into the
dive
habit of the
deeper
porch again.
into the forgotten
Easy as
Wild
weather.
West.
And the conversation had grown slowly over weeks from
Hello,
silence
guys.
to single
Let's
sentences
dive deeper
to
into
something
the
that
forgotten
occasionally ran
Wild
longer
West.
than either of them planned. Byron had been
Hello,
talking,
guys. Let's
briefly,
dive deeper
carefully,
into the forgotten
the way he talked about
Wild
anything
West.
personal, about the ranch, and what he had hoped
Hello,
to build
guys.
with it.
Let's dive
Not
deeper
wealth
into the
exactly.
forgotten
Something
Wild
more
West.
specific than that. A place that was whole.
Hello, guys.
Self-sufficient.
Let's dive deeper
That
into
didn't
the
depend on
forgotten
anyone
Wild
else's
West.
goodwill to survive. Marabella listened without
Hello,
interrupting,
guys. Let's
which was
dive
not always
deeper
her natural
into the
inclination.
forgotten Wild West.
My father lost land, he said. Not through
Hello,
laziness,
guys. Let's
through
dive
trust.
deeper into
He
the
paused.
forgotten Wild
I
West.
decided early I wouldn't make that particular mistake.
Hello,
She
guys.
looked at him.
Let's dive
Is that why
deeper
you're difficult
into
with
the
people?
forgotten Wild
He glanced
West.
at her sideways. Something that wasn't quite a smile,
Hello, guys.
but lived
Let's
near
dive
one.
deeper into
You
the
think I'm
forgotten
difficult?
Wild West.
I think you're careful, she said, and that it
Hello,
looks
guys.
like difficulty
Let's
from the
dive
outside.
deeper into the forgotten
Byron
Wild
looked back
West.
at the land. The evening was settling in its slow
Hello,
way.
guys. Let's
The sky
dive
going
deeper
from orange
into the
to deep
forgotten
blue at the
Wild
edges.
West.
That might be the most generous thing you've said
Hello,
to me,
guys.
he
Let's
said.
dive deeper
Don't get
into
comfortable,
the forgotten
she
Wild
replied.
West.
It surprised me too. This time
Hello,
he
guys.
did almost
Let's
smile.
dive deeper into
She
the
saw it
forgotten
clearly,
Wild
brief
West.
and unguarded, gone before it fully arrived.
Hello, guys.
And it did
Let's
something
dive deeper
unexpected to
into
the middle of her
forgotten
chest
Wild
that she
West.
chose not to examine immediately. The
Hello,
thing that
guys.
finally
Let's
broke the
dive
last
deeper
careful
into the
distance between them
forgotten
was
Wild
not
West.
romantic. It was practical, which suited them both.
Hello, guys. Let's
Marabella
dive
had
deeper
ridden out one
into the
afternoon to check the
forgotten
east
Wild
fence
West.
line. Something she'd started doing because it needed doing.
Hello, guys.
And because
Let's
she
dive
liked the
deeper
solitude of it.
into the forgotten Wild
The sky had
West.
been clear when she left. An hour out, it changed.
Hello, guys.
Not as dramatic
Let's
as the
dive
storm
deeper
that had started
into the
everything,
forgotten Wild
but
West.
enough. The mare she was riding, not
Hello,
Calla,
guys.
who wasn't ready
Let's
yet,
dive deeper
threw a shoe
into
in the soft
forgotten
ground near
Wild
the creek.
West.
And by the time Marabella had walked her carefully
Hello,
the long
guys.
way around
Let's
the fence
dive
line,
deeper
the
into
light
the
was going,
forgotten
and the
Wild
temperature had
West.
dropped sharply. Byron met her on the road a
Hello,
quarter
guys.
mile from the
Let's
house.
dive deeper
He had clearly
into
been
the
out looking
forgotten
for her.
Wild West.
He didn't say that directly, but it was in the set of his shoulders
Hello, guys.
and the way he
Let's
scanned
dive
her
deeper
face before he
into
looked
the
at the horse,
forgotten
which was
Wild
backwards
West.
from how he usually prioritized things.
Hello,
Through a
guys.
shoe,
Let's
she
dive
said,
deeper
before he
into
could
the
ask.
forgotten Wild
I see
West.
that. He dismounted, looked at the mare's foot,
Hello, guys.
looked at
Let's
the light.
dive deeper into
should
the
have been back 2
forgotten
hours ago.
Wild West.
I'm aware. I didn't know where you'd gone.
Hello, guys.
She looked at him.
Let's dive deeper
His voice was
into
even,
the forgotten
but something
Wild
underneath
West.
it wasn't. I didn't think I needed to account for my
Hello,
movements,
guys. Let's
she
dive
said,
deeper
but
into the
carefully,
forgotten
not
Wild
sharp.
West.
just honest. You don't? He said.
Hello, guys.
I
Let's
just-
dive deeper
He stopped,
into the forgotten
started again.
Wild West.
It's a long fence line, and the weather changed.
Hello, guys. Let's dive
Marabella
deeper
stood in the
into
cooling
the
evening
forgotten
and looked at
Wild
Byron
West.
Ardent. This man she hadn't chosen,
Hello, guys.
hadn't wanted,
Let's dive deeper
had spent years
into the
keeping at a
forgotten
careful
Wild
arm's length,
West.
and saw with sudden clarity that he had been
Hello,
worried.
guys. Let's
Not about the
dive
horse,
deeper into the
not about the
forgotten
fence line.
Wild West.
About her. I'm fine, she
Hello,
said,
guys.
more
Let's
gently than
dive
she'd said
deeper
most
into
things
the
to him.
forgotten Wild
He
West.
nodded once, jaw tight, and handed her his
Hello,
horse's
guys.
reins to hold
Let's
while
dive
he checked the
deeper
mare again.
into the forgotten Wild
She watched
West.
him work in the fading light, efficient,
Hello,
unhurried,
guys.
quietly
Let's dive
competent,
deeper into
and felt the
forgotten
last careful
Wild
wall
West.
she'd been maintaining develop a crack she
Hello,
wasn't
guys.
sure she wanted to
Let's
repair.
dive deeper into the
That
forgotten
night after
Wild
supper,
West.
neither of them went immediately to the porch or their
Hello,
separate
guys.
rooms.
Let's dive
Marabella
deeper
was at the kitchen
into the
table,
forgotten
and
Wild
Byron
West.
stopped in the doorway, the way he sometimes did,
Hello,
as
guys.
if deciding whether to
Let's
continue
dive
or
deeper
turn back.
into the forgotten
He continued.
Wild West.
He sat down across from her, without a
Hello,
particular
guys.
reason.
Let's dive
she didn't ask
deeper
for one.
into the forgotten Wild
They
West.
talked for 3 hours. About his father and hers.
Hello, guys.
About the
Let's
land
dive
and what it meant to
deeper
both
into
of
the
them.
forgotten Wild
About the
West.
misunderstanding in Grady's that had started everything,
Hello, guys.
which they had never
Let's
directly
dive
discussed,
deeper into the
and
forgotten
found themselves,
Wild West.
partway through the telling of it, doing something neither
Hello,
had done
guys.
in the other's
Let's
presence
dive
before.
deeper into
Laughing,
the forgotten Wild
quietly,
West.
At the absurdity of Dora Finch and her
Hello,
telegraph
guys.
wire mouth,
Let's dive
and the
deeper
entire
into the
machinery of a small
forgotten
town
Wild West.
that had taken a rainstorm and built a scandal from
Hello,
it.
guys. Let's
She did us a
dive
service in a
deeper
way,
into the forgotten
Byron said.
Wild West.
Marabella raised an eyebrow. A very
Hello,
roundabout
guys.
one.
Let's dive
Most
deeper
useful
into
things
the
are.
forgotten Wild West.
She looked at him across the table. Really looked.
Hello,
the way
guys.
she'd been carefully
Let's
avoiding.
dive deeper
And found
into the
that the face
forgotten
she'd
Wild
spent
West.
years deciding she didn't like had somewhere along the
Hello,
way
guys.
become a face she
Let's
looked for.
dive deeper into the forgotten
That was the thing
Wild
about hate
West.
to love, she thought. It didn't arrive announced.
Hello, guys.
It accumulated.
Let's dive
the way the
deeper
ranch
into
accumulated
the forgotten
meaning.
Wild West.
Slowly, through shared work and
Hello,
shared
guys.
weather,
Let's
and the
dive
quiet
deeper
daily
into the
decision to
forgotten
stay.
Wild West.
Byron asked her, 3 months after their wedding,
Hello,
if she would
guys.
consider the arrangement
Let's dive
permanent.
deeper into
He
the
didn't say it
forgotten
romantically.
Wild West.
He said it the way he said most things, directly,
Welcome to another
at the
Wild
kitchen
West
table
tale
on a
showing
Tuesday morning,
Love
like a
comes
practical
from
matter that needed
unexpected
settling.
means.
The arrangement,
Welcome to
she
another
repeated.
Wild West tale
The
showing
marriage.
love
I'd like it to be
comes
real.
from unexpected
He
means.
paused. If you're willing.
Welcome to another
Marabella
Wild
looked at
West
him for a
tale
long moment.
showing love
It's already
comes
real,
from
Byron,
unexpected
she said
means.
quietly. It's
Welcome
been real
to
for
another
a while.
Wild West tale showing
Something in his face
love
settled.
comes from
Not
unexpected
relief exactly,
means.
but the particular stillness
Welcome
of a
to
man who
another
had been
Wild
holding
West
something
tale
carefully
showing
and had finally
love
been
comes
told
from
he could put it
unexpected
down.
means.
He reached across the table.
Welcome to another
She let
Wild
him
West
take her
tale
hand.
showing
They were married
love
a second
comes
time,
from
in their own
unexpected
way,
means.
the following spring.
Welcome to another
Not a
Wild
ceremony,
West tale
just the
showing
two of them on the
love
east fence
comes
line
from
at dawn,
unexpected means.
the same ground where she'd walked
Welcome
back a
to
lame
another
horse
Wild
in
West
fading
tale
light,
showing
and he'd come looking
love
without being
comes
asked.
from unexpected
He
means.
told her, quietly, that she
Welcome
was
to
the
another
only person
Wild
he'd
West
ever
tale
trusted with the
showing
inside of things.
Love comes from
She told him he was
unexpected
still
means.
difficult. He said she was still
Welcome to
sharper
another
than
Wild
necessary.
West tale showing
They both knew those things were
love
true,
comes from
and neither of them
unexpected
minded
means.
anymore.
Welcome to
Kala,
another Wild
fully
West
trained by
tale
then,
showing
stood quietly
love
in the
comes
paddock near
from
the house.
unexpected means.
A good horse, patient
Welcome
and
to
steady
another
in the end.
Wild West
Once
tale
someone
showing
had taken the time to
love
understand her.
comes from unexpected
Marabella had
means.
always thought there was a lesson in that.
Welcome to another
She just
Wild
hadn't
West
known.
tale
The
showing
rainy evening she
love
ducked into
comes
Grady's
from
feed and
unexpected
supply
means.
to wait out a storm that she
Welcome
was
to
already
another
living
Wild
inside
West
it.
tale showing
The following
love
year,
comes
their
from
first child was
unexpected
born
means.
in the east bedroom of the Ardent
Welcome
ranch
to
house,
another Wild
the room
West
with the
tale
window that
showing
faced the morning
love
light.
comes from unexpected
Byron sat
means.
outside the door the entire night without
Welcome
being
to
asked.
another Wild West tale
When Patrice
showing
finally opened the door
love
and told him he
comes
could
from
come in,
unexpected
he walked to
means.
where Marabella lay tired and
Hello,
quiet and
guys.
whole.
Let's
And he
dive
sat beside
deeper
her and
into
held
the
his daughter for the
forgotten
first
Wild
time,
West.
with the careful steadiness of a man who had learned,
Hello,
late
guys.
and
Let's
honestly,
dive deeper
what it
into
meant
the
to
forgotten
tend something
Wild
worth keeping.
West.
They named her Kala.
Welcome to another video. Let's begin delving in Wild West.